Thank you everyone for coming along to my talk. Just let me start by saying my name's Andrew Sorensen and I live in Queensland, Australia. I live along a coastline which is named both the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. And our state has a motto which is beautiful one day, perfect the next. But I have to say, I've been in Krakow for a few days now, and it's absolutely stunning here. I just love this place. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and the weather gods have obviously shined on me while I've been here. I also have a nicely manicured beard from the local barber, so I'm really enjoying my stay. So my talk today is going to be a little different to most of the things that we're having at the conference. I'm going to be talking about both music and sound synthesis, of course programming music and sound synthesis. And I come from a group of fairly ridiculous programmers that over the last sort of 10 or 15 years have started live coding musical concerts in front of an audience. And you hear, this is even a duet. This is two live coders live coding a musical concert in front of an audience. And you can see we've got rock star lighting. The whole thing's going on here, right? It's very, very exciting. And it just sort of on the right-hand side and the left-hand side of the picture here, you can see our screens. So it's very common in live coding performances also to show your code so that the audience can follow along with what's going on as the performance unfolds. Of course, one of the main sort of bedrocks of this practice is sort of club scene. So a lot of electronic music happening in the club scene. This is me playing on a ship called the MS Stubnitz. It's actually an amazing arts venue that sails all around Europe, stopping at various points around the way. This was actually, it had stopped at Canary Wharf in London when this photo was taken. That's my bald head up there on the left-hand side that you can see shining out. And these kind of performances are, strangely enough, happening all around the world, and there are a lot more people involved in this now than you might at first expect. But as well as electronic music, of course, we can also generate computer music that isn't digital in nature. So here I'm actually doing a live coding performance where I'm playing on two acoustic pianos. So these two robotic pianos are being, all of the music is being generated from the code, and it's driving these two robotic pianos which are producing all of the music that the audience are listening to. And it's kind of neat, right, because in this case we're using this digital computer for generating an acoustic performance. Of course, it's important to point out that computer music has been around as long as there have been computers. So since the very earliest computers, people have been generating music for computers. This is Sirac. This was the world's fourth stored program digital computer, and it was designed, created, and built wholly in Australia. And it was commissioned in 1949. And if we have a look on this next screen here, we can see, of course, Sirac was designed largely for the standard kind of computations that were required at the time. But you can see on the right-hand face of the control panel, there's actually a speaker embedded into the panel there. And the interesting thing is this speaker was embedded into the system for debugging purposes. So programmers would use the speaker to help them debug their programs, find timing problems, and also just for more basic things like, for example, responding to program termination. So there'd be a bing, for example, when a program terminates. Now, the way the programmers actually interfaced with this was much like a register. They would really just set a register for the speaker, and then the speaker itself would generate a pulse. So whenever the register was set, there'd be a pulse sent to the speaker. Now, the interesting thing that happened was that some of these smart cookie engineers started going, wow, you know, all of a sudden we can use these pulses to create musical pitches, and those musical pitches can then be used to generate melodies. And so, and we're not quite sure of the exact date, but in either 1950 or definitely by 1951, Sirac was being used to generate music. And now, one thing you have to understand is the engineers working on these projects weren't composers, so they generally chose sort of popular music from the day as the examples that they were working with. So let me just play you two examples generated from Sirac. So these date from around about 1950-51. These are actually, I should be clear, these weren't recorded in 1951, but they're representations of the sound that was made in 1951. Right, let's have another one. Come on, they're so good. It's like the original 8-bit chiptune music, isn't it? So, and we'll have a little look a little later in the talk. I'm actually going to come back to this idea, and we're going to see how this sort of feeds into the rest of my talk today. So, this is a group of the original engineers of Sirac, and luckily a lot of this information were kind of lost for quite a long time before Paul Dornbusch did some good research to actually bring a lot of this back to light. And luckily we managed to get a couple of interviews made with some of the original designers before, unfortunately, they passed away. So what I'm going to do now is I have a recorded interview with Trevor Pearcey, and I'm going to do a little live coding performance for you now, and I'm going to use the interview with Trevor Pearcey as a sort of an underlie for the composition. So you'll be able to listen to him talking about how music was being constructed on Sirac while I'm then creating a piece for you to listen to here now. So let me just jump over to Emacs. And we're going to get started here. So I'm going to start by loading up the interview.
Let me ask a question about the first music that was played on Sirac, when it was played and what it was, and who wrote the program.
I believe Sirac was a very early machine to provide tones through a loudspeaker. The loudspeaker, of course, was initially installed so that a particular instruction, as the loudspeaker was a destination, and when coded into a program, a pulse could be set into the loudspeaker when that instruction was executed, and thereby provide the user with an indication as to where the program was at any particular moment by providing him appropriate clicks, and the user could more or less follow the running of a program, so that when the program went wild because of a spurious electronic fault occurred, he would then be warned by a change in the rhythm of the loudspeaker noise. From there, of course, it was not a very great extension to program regular tones, and we managed to provide a program with which would pass impulses to the loudspeaker in a diatonic tone, a diatonic scale, and thereafter to extend the program to controlled execution of tones and the playing of what might be called music. This was, of course, a purely experimental program to see whether this could be done. And this was, in fact, done successfully over a fairly small range of a couple of octaves of the diatonic scale. And the first tunes were after a few faulty passes. The mistakes made by myself boogie and one or two other things like that. I remember calling the chief of the division at that stage to come and listen to it, and I had suggested that we record the tones, the tunes, and get Frank Legg, who was then on 2BL, to play it over the radio station. However, Dr. Bowen, who was then chief, did not think this was good enough. I think he didn't realise the intellectual skill and effort that had gone into actually getting the machine to play specific musical sequences.
Can we ask when that would be? The dates?
1951, cannot give you a precise date.
We asked a question about the first music that was played on Syriac, when it was played, what it was, who wrote the program.
I believe Syriac was a really early machine to provide tones. Loudspeaker, of course, was initially installed so that a particular instruction, as a loudspeaker was a destination, and when coded into the program, the pulse could be set off the loudspeaker. When that instruction was executed, and thereby provide the user with an indication as to where the program was at any particular moment by providing him appropriate clicks, and the user could more or less follow the running of a program, so that when the program went wild because of a spurious electronic fault occurred, he would then be warned by a change in the rhythm of the loudspeaker noise. From there, of course, it was not a very great extension to program regular tones, and we managed to provide a program which would pass impulses to the loudspeaker in a diatonic tone, a diatonic scale, and thereafter to extend the program to controlled execution of tones and the playing of what might be called music. The first, this was of course a purely experimental program to see whether this could be done. And this was in fact unsuccessful. A fairly small
Thank you, thank you. That was my little ode to Sirac. Hopefully you heard some of Trevor Pearcey's interview as well in there. So what I'd like to do now, that I haven't tried before, so we're going to see how this goes, is everything I did then obviously was working at a fairly high level. It was all sort of phrases and notes and that kind of more kind of compositional layer. But what I want to do now is actually go right back to scratch from bedrock and build up a synthesizer over the next sort of 20 minutes, half an hour for you, and sort of slowly explore exactly how that kind of digital sound synthesis at that level works. It's going to be a very simple synthesizer, but I hope you'll get something out of it. And I'm going to try and make it simple enough that by the end of the half an hour, you really should be able to go away and write your own synthesizer. So let me just going to get started again. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need is that we start with what is effectively a callback from the audio device driver, and it's requesting a value for every sample and every channel that's running through the system at the time. So in stereo, for example, we'll have 2 channels, and the standard sample rate we're going to be working with today is 44,100. So it's going to request 44,100 samples times 2 channels every second. And it's our job to be able to fulfill that request by returning a sensible value. So sensible values in digital audio signal processing go from 1.0 through to negative 1.0, and this correlates to the speaker cone. So 1.0 is a positive voltage to the speaker cone, which is pushing the cone forward, and a negative 1 is a negative voltage, which is pushing the cone back. So of course, this is how sound is being generated. The cone then is creating the pressure waves, which are traveling through the air, which are then hitting your eardrum, and then your inner ear and your cochlea, and you're hearing that as frequencies. But it's these pulsations of the cone of the speaker that's actually generating those pressure waves. So the absolute simplest thing we can do, so as I was saying before, we take a time and we take a channel, and this is going to be a callback. You can think about it really almost as a direct callback from the speaker itself, saying what position should my cone be in at any one of these 44,100 sample points in the second. So the simplest thing we can do is this, which is, I'm just going to turn this down, safety first. Which is white noise, okay? So all this is doing is gating on the, that's okay. Sorry? Back up, yeah. All good. Okay, now the first thing we're going to look at is that, so all we're doing is generating random numbers. And at the moment, all I'm doing is actually generating positive random numbers, which really means that the cone is only pulsing forward. It's a bit more complicated than that because there's AC coupling involved and it doesn't end up being like that. But you can think about it like that. Now, the first thing we're going to do is have a look at this multiplication. So the multiplication is in audio speak again, or it's going to change the volume of the signal that we're listening to. So if I change this here, we'll hear the value, hear the volume of the noise change. Okay, so that's our first little example. Now, the next thing we're going to have a look at is how we turn it off. Okay, so if we want to stop it, of course, all we do is return 0, which is just going to keep the cone in the center, not moving at all. And we get silence, okay? So hopefully you picked up on that idea. Now, you remember earlier I was talking about Sirac and the pulses from the speaker. So now we're going to do the same thing here. What we're going to do is we're going to introduce these impulses into the system, which is effectively just like sending 1 every now and then. So let me define a frequency. I'll set that to 100 for starters, and an amplitude. And all we're going to do here is we're going to do a modulo of time with the frequency. So we divide the sample rate, 44,100, by the frequency, and then we send an impulse of 1, or else 0. So this is if then else, basically, that we have here. Now I'm going to surround this with a multiplication like we used before for amplitude, just so we have some amplitude control. We turn down for safety. We compile this in, and now if I turn it up, you can hear these pulses, and this is pulsing at a frequency of 100. Now I'm just going to put a clamp on the frequency because, you know, knowing me, I'll do a divide by 0 or some ridiculously infinite frequency, so let me just clamp that value. And now down here, if we change the frequency, let me start it off a little slower. So this is an interesting property of sound, right, is that really what is the distinction between a rhythm and a pitch? Well, effectively it becomes psychoacoustic, and at some point our brain starts stopping hearing a rhythm and starting hearing a pitch. So let me just bring this up slowly for you. Okay. Now, the next interesting thing is that you saw me just doing, 100, 200, 300, 400, and yet you might have noticed that those pitches sounded kind of reasonably harmonious, right? So let me just do that again for you. So this was first discovered by the Pythagoreans, and it led Plato to, or at least not just Plato, but Plato and other philosophers, Greek philosophers of the time, to describe the harmony of the spheres. And this is because they found that these perfect integer ratios actually magically sort of formed interesting and nice, aurally nice harmonic tones. So we've had a look at what multiplication does. It changes the gain of a signal. Now we're going to have a look at what addition does, and we're going to mix these two ideas. So I'm going to So here we're going to say a frequency of 2, and let's say a frequency of 3. We're going to start at 100. And 2, and we turn down for safety. Okay, so where we multiply signals together, we're changing the amplitude or the gain of the signal, and where we're using addition, we're actually summing the signals together. So now we're actually listening to a perfect fifth. And I can keep adding those ratios that we were looking at before. Whoop, let's not do that. Okay, so we could keep going up, but we're starting to push. We're going to be a bit safe today. We're not going to go too overboard on the speakers in here, as I don't know them. So the addition then is summing these signals together. Now, let me show you a really interesting thing. So far, remembering that these are single pulses coming in on these modulo equals 0, okay? Now, what we could do is we could extend the pulse out. So we could say rather than just 1 0, we're actually going to turn that into a longer pulse. So that's easy enough to do. We can use pulse width, something called pulse width. And this should give us basically the same thing that we had before. So let me take this out, put frequency, get rid of all this, compile this in, and we have the same thing we had before. But an interesting thing happens when we start changing this pulse width. Can't speak. First of all, I'll turn the amp down. Pulse width. So we're starting with 1, now 2, 3. Set that to 200. Not going to worry about that. Now, what I really want you to hear there is that when I'm changing those pulse width values, the pitch of the sound isn't changing. All that's changing is the timbre of the sound, so what the quality of the sound is, what we're actually hearing. So I'm going to do a little experiment now. We're going to use a delay line. And we're going to initialize the delay line to random values. And then internally here, we're actually just going to call into this delay line using exactly the same formula that we're currently using. So we want by time, and we're still going to multiply this by the amplitude. Okay, so we'll just turn this down again. Now, what's actually super cool about this is that this is just white noise, exactly what we had before, right? These are just completely random values. So this is exactly the same as the white noise we were listening to earlier, except that we're taking a smaller chunk of the white noise and repeating it. And it's pretty incredible that our ears have the ability to discern this pattern that we're listening to. Now, what's really interesting is if I reload the delay line with different random values, we'll again hear that as a timbral change. All the same pitch, but the timbre of the sound is changing. Okay, so now we're getting close to introducing our first instrument. And what we're going to do is I'm going to make a physical model of a string for you. Okay, and this is a really simple model, but it's very effective. So, what we need to do to make our physical model of a string, we can turn the sound down for the moment, is we need a filter. And an audio filter is, in the sense that we're using it here, responsible, we're going to make a low-pass filter, which is basically going to cut off the higher frequencies of our sound. The reason we want this is because a string, when you pluck it, starts with a lot of high energy frequencies and then loses that over time. So we're going to use our filter for this. So let's make a trivial little low-pass filter here. Okay, that has to be the simplest low-pass filter in the history of filters. Okay, and it's basically just averaging. And if you think about what it's doing, it makes complete sense, right? It's just doing an averaging of the signal over time, which means that over time it's going to slowly take the higher frequencies out first. Okay, so now moving down, we don't need pulse width anymore, pulse width, but instead I'm going to set the output of the delay line and then copy this line down. So that's retrieving and now setting the delay line. And all we're going to do is we're going to filter this output, and then we can multiply it by amplitude and we can multiply it by the output. okay? So what's happening here is we're sending this burst of white noise, and then the filter's taking over and cutting out all those high frequencies for us. So every time I redo this, and in fact, although this is very simple, this is actually the principle used behind a lot of physical modelling instruments, with this very noisy attack and then a filtered decay of frequencies over time. So let me abstract this into a little function here, which we'll just call a init D line, let's say. And this is just going to do the same thing I was doing before, init D line. Okay. But now we can turn this into a function that actually plays it as a note. Okay. So we're going to pass in a pitch and an amplitude. We're going to need all of this guff. Let's pop this in here. We're going to initialize the delay line. We're going to set the frequency of the sound. Now here I'm going to cheat and use a little prepared function, MIDI to frequency. This is just going to take like a piano note value. It's easier for me to work with and convert it into a pitched value. And the amplitude. And we compile that, and now we should be able to call our string. Okay, so now we're kind of back where we were at the start. So let me now throw this into a little recursive function so that we can actually generate some notes with this. So here we go. We'll say, let's just call this riff. We're going to do something really simple. We're just going to go play string, pitch, we'll leave it at 0.3, we'll pass pitch in, and down here we'll just say if pitch is equal to 60, return 63, otherwise 60, simple. We'll start off with 60. Okay, so now at the moment we've got a really dry signal, and we're used to listening to acoustic instruments with some reverberation, through the space. So we're not going to do a full reverb, we're going to do a cheaty reverb, which is we're going to do another little delay line. And then we'll use this delay effect to add a little bit of space to this guitar sound that we have. So let's now just program up a little digital delay. Delay. And we're going to need a delay line, similar to what we had before. We're going to make this one a bit longer though. And we're going to need a delay time, so how long we want the delay to be. Let's just say 5,000 samples. And we need a decay rate, so how much the delay is going to decay over time. So we'll set that to 0.3. We need to pass an input to our function, so this is obviously the signal that we want to delay. And now we're pretty good to go. So we're just going to calculate an index, and the index is just modulo the time by the delay time. And we're going to multiply that by 2 because we have 2 channels. And then we need to calculate the output of our delay. So now we're just getting from the delay line the index plus the channel, and we're multiplying this by the decay because we want this to decay over time, and then we're going to add in our input. Okay? Now, what we need to do is we need to then set this into our delay line, which is again going to be plus index channel and out, and that's all there is to it. There's out. So we compile delay, and now we need to go and find our sound function up here, and we can wrap this amplitude output in the delay. Let's just wrap the output. So we need delay, time, chan, and we will now restart the riff, which we stopped before. And let me just change the decay of this a little bit. Or we could change the delay time. Okay. Everyone hear that all right? So this is actually how a lot of, we're not going to get into convolution, reverbs or anything, but originally in computer music, this is actually how most reverbs were made, by using a bunch of different delay lines, all with different lengths, so that they reflected the kind of reflections you would have in a physical space. So for example, it's going to take longer for my voice to reflect off the wall over here than it would over here, for example. And by using a number of delay lines together was a way for them to introduce reverb into early computer music systems. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, we're getting pretty close to the end. I just want to add a second instrument so that you can have some idea of polyphony of two things playing at the same time. And I'm going to do a little FM synthesizer, very much kind of like a classic Yamaha DX7. So we're going to start by making an oscillator, which is going to be a higher order function. And we just need to, actually let's go if on the first channel increment phase 2 pi, and then we want one sample and the frequency. And the cosine of phase by the amplitude, and voila, we have an oscillator. Except we need a channel. Channel. Okay. So now we have an oscillator. Can't hear it yet because I haven't done anything with it, but we do have an oscillator in theory. So now we need to make a second sound generating function, similar to the one we did for the plucked string algorithm, but instead for the FM synthesizer. So I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because I think I'm already running out of time. But let me just quickly program this up for you. So it's going to take a frequency similar to what we've been doing before, and an amplitude. I'll start that at 0. And then it's going to take these higher order functions, both starting with a phase of 0, 01, 02. And then we are going to pass in also 2 configuration parameters to allow us to change the modulation index of the FM synthesizer. So now, FM sound, we take a time and a channel for all of our sound functions. And now we can use 01. It takes a channel, and then it takes an amplitude, which is our main amplitude. And then we're going to modulate the frequency with the second oscillator. So the second oscillator is modulating the frequency of the first oscillator. So we pass 02, we pass chan, and then we're going to use these coefficients that I added, which will allow us to change the sound on the fly. Okay, And so now when we jump back up to our sound generation function, this is a bit kludgy, but we're going to then just add in here the new FM sound, which is going to take a time and a channel, and we're adding it to the output of our string sound. And so we'll get the mix of those two signals. Let me compile that in. But we're not hearing anything yet because now we need a player, the same as we did previously. So let me copy the player from the string. Oops, I got all of our stuff from before. And we'll call this play FM. And so these are going to have to be, what do we call that? FM sound. FM sound. We won't need that. We do need that. FM A and B. And now, oh, we don't need that. And now we have a player for our new FM instrument. So we can jump back up to riff, we can copy this, and we can now go play FM, and crossed fingers, all this will just magically work. Not so much. I know why, because we have two more components that we need. And so now we have our FM instrument playing at the same time as our plucked string instrument. And we can now use these parameters that we added to change the frequency modulation that's going on. So let me... So one thing I like to do is to make this a little random. Now currently we're playing this separate to the delay, so now let's just switch the position of the FM and actually put it as part of the delay cycle as well. So we'll just pop back up here to, where are we? Here. And we're going to go delay, FM sound time chan without time chan, actually no, we need out times amp. 0. Now you should hear that the FM synthesizer is also going through our same delay. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. So we've learned a little bit about the basics of digital signal processing. We've created a low-pass filter. We've created a physically modeled string. We've created an FM synthesizer. We've created a delay effect. And we've done all of that without having to restart our system, right? So there's something I want you to think about here, which is that we've just explored the space of sound without using any libraries at all, doing everything from scratch, and we've done it all in the real physical world while listening to those changes while they're going on behind the scenes, which gives us a much greater appreciation for what it is that we're building. If we can hear the thing, then it makes it just that much more easy to model the thing. So just like the alchemists of old that sort of worked with these base materials and stirred them up to produce new structures and find new materials, we're kind of doing the same thing in the computer. We're using code as a way to explore a domain by changing it and manipulating it and see how it affects the world. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.